Hey, welcome back to Garbeardia. I know it's been a while, and I apologize, but things been a mite crazy, say the least. But we have for you here the last chapter of the first Emily Bronze book. Sorry it's taking so long, but things have just been a bit messed up in terms of getting things done on time, and holidays are a pain in the ass in general. Just so you guys know, I'm going to be working with Canoe Tree here in a bit to get the second Veil Rider book published and then the first Emily Bronze book published. So that should all be lots of fun to deal with. Additionally, be sure to stop by the sponsors or affiliates with the channel. First one being Redcon 1. The channel does earn money now through Redcon 1 when you buy your protein powder and all your workout supplement needs. So if you need protein powder, protein bars, pre-workout, workout supplements, vitamins, anything that might help you in the gym and help you be healthier, stop on by Redcon 1 and pick you up something you need. There are discount codes down below that can make it even more affordable for you, as well as supporting the channel in its own little special bodybuilding way. The second affiliate is Skull Splitter Dice. If you need your click-clack shiny math rocks for your D&D games in real life, stop on by Skull Splitter Dice and find you a set that you might like. Again, the channel does earn money through sales with Skull Splitter Dice and Redcon 1. So, if you don't just want to give me money, which I understand, you actually want to buy something and get something back, then these two affiliates can help you do that. Additionally, if you have any needs for paint for war games or your miniatures for D&D, stop on by War Games Delivered and get you some paint and brushes and all kinds of fun stuff you might need to make your models look splendid, beautiful, and impeccable just like you. Anywho, enough further ado, let's go ahead and get this chapter rolling.
Chapter 15 Vegas Twists. Emily winced as the cargo elevator shuddered harshly, buffeting both her fellow divers and the Caturcanach workfolk who were heading down below Las Vegas in order to get their linens done. Emily had chewed over rumors and the methods to go below Las Vegas with Maril, Davin, Yapuya, and Tarj for a few days as they stayed in the Cat's Paw. While most divers went in through the sewer system, others went in via the many hotels and casinos that lined the area, as many had found use of the newly formed underground hives. Las Vegas had been known for its underground shanty towns far before the world was drowned, but thanks to the new visitors from other planes, it had been expanded far beyond the simple concrete conduits that ferried wastewater. Yapuya was the largest opponent of going underground, having made it quite clear that she was in fact part bird, not part beetle, and wanted to stay in the hotel to frolic with her Caturcanachs. This was the main reason that she stood beside Davin and not Emily, her feathers bristling as she clutched her M79 grenade launcher in her wing talons. As the elevator continued to rattle downwards in the depths of the earth, Emily leaned to the side towards one of the female Caturcanach. This one not only had her septum and lip pierced, but also seemed to be slowly collecting pin-up tattoos all along her neck and arms, looking more at home on a wooden sailing boat than an elevator full of laundry. As Emily leaned towards her to speak, she brushed her light gray hair away from her eyes, looking up to the human.
Problem, miss?
Emily waved her hand in a friendly manner. Oh, no problems here. I'm just wondering, how far down does this thing go? The Caturcanach flicked an ear as she thought, two of its gold piercings ringing against each other.
I believe the elevator goes half a mile below ground, miss. It is the most direct way to the Vegas Twists, as most have to travel through the sewers. I'm actually surprised they let you come down here with us. But then again, I heard how you paid.
She winked at Emily. The human cleared her throat as Davin chuckled behind her. Tarj leaned against the huge steel laundry bins beside him as he spoke, his M240B hanging over his shoulder.
And you go all the way down here to do your laundry. Why not just go across the street like any other business?
One of the male Caturcanach spoke up this time, looking up at Tarj as he replied in a matter-of-fact voice.
We did, but the best laundry services moved underground. We tried using a different company, but it just wasn't the same. Our clan leader decided to have this shaft made instead.
Tarj cocked his head at the smaller male Caturcanach and grinned toothily.
Why would a successful laundry move half a mile underground?
Cheaper.
The male Caturcanach replied, shrugging a shoulder as Tarj shared a look with Davin.
Cheaper, he says.
Davin shrugged as well.
Probably easier to keep cool down underground. Then, if you have to clean blood off silk sheets, police are less likely to come sniffing.
Both the Caturcanachs and their passengers chuckled at this, while Yapuya seemed to bristle even more, the only one not joining in on the laughter. Time continued to drip by as they descended down, the small digital pad reading out their depth. When the counter hit a quarter of a mile, the tattooed female Caturcanach's mood changed as if she had gone through a barrier. She moved in closer to Emily, leaning against the bins with her elbows resting upon the lip. She spoke in a soft voice, eyes focusing on the doors in front of them.
Do you go down seeking treasure?
Careful. Never know who works for who.
The Torque muttered into her mind, and the Caturcanach's eyes flashed to it as if she had heard. I know, I'm not going to go blabbing just because a pretty face asks a question, Emily muttered back to it, and she kept her own voice quiet as she answered the Caturcanach's question. I'm just going down to find something an old friend left on a dive, that's all. The Caturcanach's lavender eyes flicked to the digital reader as it beeped out another digit, then back to Emily.
First time going down to the Vegas Twists?
It is, Emily said, and the Caturcanach flexed her fingers.
Not everyone down there is bad. You find good folk here and there amongst the races that prefer the dark. But your friend is right. There is very little police down here. The only real forms being hired guards that keep you safe within company grounds. As nice as it may be, there are dark things down here too.
Emily slowly leaned back against the same bin, her mare's leg hanging jauntily in its holster. Such as? The Caturcanach bit at her lip for a moment as her thumb worked along the pad of her fingers.
Cadaver gamblers. Those who cannot pay with coin or property come down here to gamble with their organs instead, hoping to make it big and go up to the normal casinos. Cannibal cabals who seek to enjoy their preferred protein down in the depths. Mafias and gangs from other planes making war down here to keep a foothold on this world. Heroes of old who have sunk so low, they travel below to try to relive their glory days on the dive. You'll even find a few gods down here, begging for change and worshippers, promising gifts and abilities for a prayer, or sup of blood.
Does she lie? Emily asked the Torque, and the voice came back to her in a flat tone.
She speaks the truth. She fears going down there, despite her bravado.
The Caturcanach's cheeks flushed, and Emily narrowed her eyes at the reaction. If the little cat-eared woman could hear her Torque speaking, she didn't want to bring it up here in the open. What about this place I heard about, the place where the divers go?
The depths,
she replied, and she brought an arm down to pick at the hem of her half-kilt.
Some say the depths are a great winding gut that devours and consumes those who are unlucky enough to become trapped in it. I have a brother down there. Somewhere.
One of the other larger male Caturcanachs spoke up sharply, locking dagger-like yellow eyes to the other's lavender.
Do not speak of Davin. He left the clan. He is dead to us one way or the other.
Emily, Davin, Tarj, Maril, and even Yapuya narrowed their eyes at the male Caturcanach's curtness to the apparent loss of the female Caturcanach's brother, and the elevator fell into an uneasy silence as the depth readout continued to beep along. The only sound beyond the beep was the light sniffs coming from the Caturcanach beside Emily, and the light tut of sound as her tears fell down onto her woolen half-kilt. Maril popped a bubble with her chewing gum as she mulled over the words in her head, and at just under half a mile down she popped another bubble and stepped up beside Emily. Your brother look like you? Maril asked, and the Caturcanach looked to Maril, then turned her head nervously back to the larger male with yellow eyes. Maril saw this and chuckled. Don't worry about him. You can tell me.
She will know.
The male began, going to move towards the lavender-eyed Caturcanach, but was halted by the barrel of Maril's snub-nosed M2 peeking around Emily with the heft of a well-muscled arm. He was doubly halted as Emily lazily pulled her mare's leg from its holster, holding it low and cocking the hammer back with her thumb. Emily smiled at the larger male. I believe my associate was asking a question. Best you stay in your lane, laundry boy. The other Caturcanachs in the elevator all looked around wide-eyed and slowly crept away from the cone of fire, while the larger male was visibly bristling, his tail fluffing up in rage as his hand paused at the handle of a knife at his hip.
She won't shoot, will she?
Asked another male Caturcanach to Tarj, and the half-orc shrugged his lips.
Depends on if she gets angry, or if the centaur gets jealous.
At the orc's words, the Caturcanachs around him shrunk back further, huddling in the corner. The lavender-eyed Caturcanach looked up to Maril and fidgeted with her half-kilt, her stomach and voice tight with nerves despite her punk-like appearance.
We share the same features. His eyes are like mine, as is his hair. We have matching torques. given to us by Mother before she died.
She managed to get out, and her voice caught in her throat as she went to say something else.
She's hiding something.
The Torque said into Emily's mind, and Emily knelt down, leaning her head close to the Caturcanach's left ear. "Does he speak the truth?" she whispered, and the Caturcanach now bristled herself, her secret uncovered. She, however, didn't answer in word, merely nodding her head with a soft twitch towards the ground.
He was a hired guard to hear the voices of the dark,
she said in a hushed voice towards Emily's neck, and the Torque hummed in her head.
Ah, I see now. She and her brother are touched. It's why she can hear me, I suppose.
Yes, my lord.
The Caturcanach whispered again, and Emily squinted an eye. My lord?
Don't fret over titles. I would wager to believe a group of divers also knew this and hired her brother to increase their odds of survival. What they didn't know is that if you can hear the monsters that lurk in the shadows, they can hear you just as clearly.
Emily frowned as the Caturcanach gave a hiccup, tears now flowing down her cheeks, and once more the Torque's voice came.
You are brave, my little animal-eared girl, to still come all the way down here, despite your brother. He must have gone missing shortly before we arrived for such pain to still be so fresh, yes?
The Caturcanach nodded again, sadly, and held her hands to her tattooed arms.
This woman, whose neck I adorn, is a good sort. I'm sure she will do her best, but you must understand that your brother may not come back the same if we are able to bring him back at all. I know what kind of hell awaits us below. I ask that you understand the risk and the sorrow of what we may find.
She nodded again, and Emily looked up to lock eyes with the larger male Caturcanach, his sharp yellow eyes having been watching them the entire time. Emily could see the anger and rage in those yellow eyes, and she pulled out the keys to her Zundap. I need someone to look after my bike. The lavender-eyed Caturcanach looked up, sniffing and rubbing at her cheeks with her palms.
Miss?
I need someone to look after my bike and my room. I request that you do so. Is that going to be an issue, sir? Emily said, biting off the last word with a growl as she held out her Zundap keys and card key to the Caturcanach before her. The larger male Caturcanach wrinkled his nose in frustration and bared his teeth as he responded in a strangled tone.
Of course it won't be. We are always looking to serve our VIPs to our fullest extent.
Then I leave it to you, Emily said, turning her head in a way that it implied a question.
Maeve,
she said, holding out her hand to take the keys Emily held out. I'll leave it to you, Maeve, Emily said with a soft smile, and placed both her motorcycle keys and the card key to her room in the upturned hand of the Caturcanach. Maeve's lavender eyes stared down at the keys, to Emily and Morel, then flicked to where she knew the larger Caturcanach stood, boring a hole into the back of her head with his yellow eyes. If anyone gives you trouble, they can expect my friend here to iron 'em out, Emily said with a wry grin, and jabbed her thumb to Morel behind her, who winked at Maeve, then pursed her lips in a mocking kiss to the yellow-eyed Caturcanach. He growled in his throat at Morel, ears pinned to his head, but they perked back upwards when the digital readout beeped 3 times, and the elevator hissed to a stop, half a mile below the ground.
We have arrived,
The yellow-eyed Caturcanach hissed, and slammed the door release button with the side of his fist. When the doors opened, a myriad of colors flooded the space as the neon signs of the Vegas Twists were exposed. As they all walked out of the elevator into the haze of neon lights and signs, Maeve ran up behind Emily and pulled on her hand, causing her to turn back towards the elevator. Maeve's ears were low to her head, but said nothing, simply gritting her teeth before running back towards the elevator with Emily's keys in hand, joining more of her kin catching a ride back up with fresh laundry. Emily stood there, arms still limply outstretched as the doors shuttered and closed, snapping away her line of sight to Maeve's worried face.
What was that about?
Asked Tarj, pulling down his 240B from resting on his shoulder to a relaxed front hang.
We had a small chat.
The Torque said, a light chuckle dancing on his words. What do you mean you two had a nice chat?
She worries about you befalling the same fate as her brother. He had a contact down here named Mistress Errata. She apparently owns some kind of store down on the lower declines towards the depths.
Anything else? Emily asked, leaving her mare's leg in her hands instead of putting it back in its holster.
She asked me to look out for you. That is all.
Emily breathed in through her nose as she stood there watching the doors to the elevator, then turned around to take in the breadth of the Vegas Twists. As everyone else milled about, taking in the sights, Emily thought it was as if someone had taken Las Vegas back through the time to the era of cassette tapes and synthwave, then tucked it inside a huge cavern riddled with cave networks. The most prominent features were the great support beams of stone, steel, and other elements that reached up towards the lumen ceiling, supporting it so it wouldn't come crashing down onto the sprawling city below. The roof of the cavern was so high that with the clouds of steam, it almost looked like a gloomy night sky, the clouds reflecting the purples, blues, reds, and even oranges of the neons that sparkled down below. If Emily had to reckon, this place may even be a 1-to-1 scale of the Las Vegas above, save for maybe the airport. Around them, denizens of the Vegas twists bustled back and forth, a hodgepodge of all races and some that she had never seen before up to now. Humanoids with large, bat-like ears, insectoid-type people who clicked their maws as they prattled on in English to their friends, and even some kind of centaur lived down here, their horse-like bodies drawn in and bony as if they hadn't eaten for years. Their faces were equally gaunt, but striking in all the same way. Painted up in tribalistic patterns, Emily noticed Muriel giving these other centaurs the suspicious side-eye, and clicked her teeth in annoyance as a male gave her a wink, his high cheekbones reminding Emily of a K-pop starling. As they made their way down a large side street, Yapuya grumbling and kicking along beside, Emily felt like she had seen places like this before in movies. The entire area felt so Blade Runner in aesthetics that she wouldn't have been surprised if she turned her head and saw a film crew tracking Harrison Ford down an alleyway, or eating noodles at one of the many standing stalls. Bicycles clanged their bells as they zipped by. Rickshaws ferrying elves and dwarfs ran past, their wagons littered with neon sign advertisements that threw warm hues of green or red into the air. The neon blurred hard down here in the comparison to the surface, as the lack of wind or any real airflow meant fog hung low around their heads, flitting around in streams. If not for the neon lights, the scattering of lit windows behind curtains helped fill out the rest of the buildings, almost as if they were signal lights to lure you in. People parted before them as they walked in a cluster down the right side of the road, or tipped their hats to them in greeting. Others held out little pamphlets for shows and plays, while some held out empty hands, hoping for a coin or casino chip. The side street they were near the end of was mostly restaurants, standing booths and small hole-in-the-wall cateries, and at the end of the street was a far larger main street where electric vehicles whirred and hissed by, the lines in the jet-black road illuminated with a faint yellow glow of internal lights. Here they saw more people dressed and armed like them, roaming down the sidewalk in their downtime or puffing on odd-looking instruments that streamed out smoke in odd colors.
Why is Yoipa even underground? What is Yoipa to do? Fly around near top of cave and choke on fumes?
Yapuya huffed and hissed through her teeth at a ragged-looking man who was offering her coupons for Dave's House of Currywurst, now 67% real animal meat.
Yoy, you're part of the team. You never know when we may need you.
Davin said, giving her a bump on the shoulder with his elbow. Tarj puffed a breath through his nose.
Yeah, or seduce someone for a key.
That was one time. Plus, dwarf was ugly. Not like Yoipa had to try hard in first place.
Yapuya huffed again, paused, then smashed the buttstock of her M79 into Tarj's shin.
Quit bringing up old tales.
Tarj barked out a painful laugh and came down onto his knee, pushing Yapuya on the shoulder so she bumped into Davin. Davin just laughed and rustled Yapuya's hair.
That's right, our little feathered Marilyn Monroe.
So where do we go from here? Should we find another room? Muriel asked, looking from one side to the other as she watched traffic. Emily breathed the heavy air into her lungs, then blew out a puff of fog. It really was quite cold down here, and the damp wasn't helping. How's it so cold down here? We're half a mile underground. It should be almost unbearably hot. Magic fuckery, good HVAC systems, frost rag letting out farts every 2 minutes through a vent. Who knows? Muriel replied dryly as she flicked her tail, waiting for the crossing light to change. Despite others wanting to cross the street, many of the denizens gave the group a wide berth still. Muriel's ears perked up when a voice piped up from a nearby traffic light pole, and the party all glanced over at it. Traffic pausing for 1 minute. Please cross with haste. Take caution as a combustion fox escaped near the tottering Minotaur Casino, the cheerful voice said. Then the crossing lights flicked to the color green. Combustion fox? Muriel asked, stepping forward with the rest of the group while others spilled around them in quick walks or even jogs. Sounds kinda cute, doesn't it? Emily mused, resting her mare's leg against her shoulder. Tarj snorted.
Not if it explodes. Imagine what your yard would look like after a day.
Yapuya giggled despite her hatred of the place she was currently in, and the crew made their way swiftly across the busy 10-lane street. On this side of the street things were far busier and faster paced as those on the prowl for their vices hurried back and forth. shadows of hoods or hats hiding their faces.
I believe it is that way, just beyond the edge of these larger buildings. We should see a sign bearing the terraces.
The Torque said, and Emily nudged Marill in the side of her humanoid hip with her elbow, while pointing in the same direction the Torque indicated. Let's head that way. We don't have a need for these places. Marill raised an eyebrow while a cheeky smile parted her lips. Really? You don't want to go to the Happy Surgeon and gamble with one of your livers? Emily tilted her head up to look at Marill, the violet and red neon reflecting off her black hair and braid. Yeah, I'm pretty sure, she said with a smile, then reached up and pinched Marill's cheek while giving it a wiggle. Marill snorted out a laugh and smacked Emily's hand away. Then the two began walking down the sidewalk as everyone else followed behind. Tarj looked up and around at the casinos as they walked by, while Yapuya began pestering Davin to let her ride on his shoulders. Tarj saw one that caught his eye, then spoke up to the rest of the crew.
The Kissing Burn. Come and gamble alongside real succubuses and demons. I thought that wasn't possible, though, for demons to just be traipsing about.
It's not.
Davin replied, who finally gave in and picked up Yapuya so she could clamber up onto his shoulders.
More than likely, the women are from another plane and simply look the part.
Tarj pushed his lips together in a thoughtful way and hummed in his throat before looking around to the next casino.
Violet and Crimson. A taste of your dreams and nightmares. I don't know about that one.
At least other casino promise bit of flesh.
Yapuya piped up, having wrapped her wings around Davin's head. Davin chuckled.
I wouldn't be so sure, Yoy. Never know what goes on down here.
Tarj craned his neck around to spy another casino as they neared the edge of the terraces, and he squinted at one that lay just beyond a smaller cluster of neon-drowned restaurants.
The old wood when times were good,
he said, his voice low as a pair of dark-skinned elves came out of the doors wearing steel cavalry armor. Marill raised her head and took the building in as the front doors were opened to let in another customer, and out spilled the sultry tones of a woman singing a happy-sounding song in Gaelic. This was one of the only buildings not wrapped in neon lights, and was instead beset by crawling vines that encased every inch of stone and brick, only leaving the windows untouched. The grand sign of the casino was wrapped in the same vines, with a single living vine underlining the bold print of the casino's namesake. Looks like something a druid would make, Marill remarked in a murmur, and squinted as a fey-looking cocktail waitress walked by the doors, her glittering wings alluring in their synthwave twilight tone.
Why aren't they up top then? They seem normal enough.
Tarj said, then waved at another group of divers who turned to greet them from their stand-in stall, steaming bowls of cataphract stew just being set down in front of them. Well, Emily began, rubbing the pad of her thumb back and forth along the hammer of her mare's leg. If they're down here, it must be for a reason. Just what that reason is, I'm not keen to know. Everyone agreed in low tones, and their journey to the edge of the terraces went without further mention of the casino, or any curiosity as to how plants grew down in the dark without sunlight. When they arrived at the terraces, the mood quickly turned from jaunty sidewalks filled with criers to a sprawling market square with ramshackle huts crammed in between freshly built businesses and suites. This area was far thicker with divers, and with divers came people seeking their coin and treasures. Stalls and shops selling everything under the sun dotted along the many avenues and streets, their signs proclaiming the best prices, and at times the signs even began to battle themselves. Emily stopped with everyone else to watch the sign for an erotic meat burger shop suddenly pull out a knife and sprout robotic legs, apparently taking offense to the sign of a pulled noodle store across the street. Said offending sign had sprouted an arm itself, and gave the burger sign a waving neon pink middle finger. The challenge was met, and both sides went into full aggro mode, charging towards each other to the middle of the street while screeching in broken binary. The occurrence must have been common, as those around the signs began taking bets on which of the two would win this time.
As charming as this is, we are close to where the little Maev wanted us to go. We need to look for a low building with a swooping, peaked roof. Out front should be a single red lantern.
The Torque piped up, and Emily shook her head. Right, come on, let's go, Emily said, and they left behind the cheering crowd and sounds of roaring signs in an honor battle. The further down they went into the terraces, the deeper they got into the true belly of the beast. Here, workshops constantly whirred and ground, repairing vehicles, creating weapons, or sawing away at large gems. Other shops churned out ammunition, flares, or worked spells to imbue into trinkets. No matter where they went, workers and those who lived among them hung around on stools and drank coffee or tea, and Emily couldn't help but smile at the camaraderie that grew in this area. Dark elf, gloomwalker, insectoid, and beastkin traded the news and jokes as they rested. human, dwarf, and orc played card games or rubbed their chins over neon-lit game board tables. There was, however, no real progress in finding a building that Emily only knew a vague idea of. So on their third pass around the district, Emily was cold, angry, and ready to start asking questions. Emily approached a gaggle of workers who were on break, the cluster of them rounded around a digital gaming board on which 2 players would battle with armies. Next to the cluster was a coffee and borscht stand with multiple tables strewn around it. Emily plopped into a chair near the group, everyone else finding their own seat at the same table. Muriel tapped the toe of her front hoof in annoyance at having to stand, but a dark-skinned gloomwalker quickly ran into a small side room and pulled out a rustic-looking ground pillow for her to kneel on. He struggled with the pillow as he ambled around the tables, but his bright white eyes peered up at Muriel alongside an equally bright smile.
Miss Centaur, I have this for you. It is small, but it will cushion your knees in fetlock.
Oh, well, thank you, Muriel stammered out, coughing into her fist as the gloomwalker moved a chair out of the way of the long table and placed the cushion on the ground. As he fluffed the ground pillow, he looked back up to Muriel, his smile still bright on his face.
Don't get many centaur down here. Mostly just the pole chin.
Muriel looked to the table where the rest of her compatriots were watching her with idle smiles, Emily lulling her head back and fixing a grin at her. Yeah, well, I don't see why we would be down here. No sun, no grass, or, outpolching those spooky goth senile-looking folk. The gloomwalker laughed politely, his wide pointed ears seeming to lighten softly as his eyes brightened with the pleasure of the humor.
Yes, they are what you speak of. They are not bad folk, if a bit crude and dark of humors. Are you down in the twists on business?
He placed his hands in front of him, still smiling politely as Muriel's ears were perked up more in nerves than alarm. Muriel looked back towards the table for a hint as to how she should answer, but only saw that the grins of everyone else had grown. Yapuya was making a lewd suggestion with her ring claws, all the while the tip of her tongue was poking out from between her gritting teeth. Muriel looked back to the gloomwalker, her hoofs fidgeting. Yeah, here on work. Gonna do some diving, maybe find some shiny, stuff. Emily struggled at controlling her lungs, but a rude inhale of snorting laughter went up her nose, and Tarj had to bury his face into the crook of his elbow, shoulders shuddering as he fought to keep Emily from making him laugh. Devon politely looked up from the menu he was patiently reading, and looked over to the gloomwalker.
We are indeed here on business. My friend has been walking for some time, and I'm sure she would like to take a rest. Would you mind grabbing the table some tea?
The gloomwalker knew he was being dismissed, and his darkly shaded lip twitched in annoyance as he bowed politely towards Davin.
Of course, sir. I'll be right back with your tea.
He turned and stepped away, but not before Emily caught the gloomwalker twitch his head towards Muriel, obviously more keen to keep talking to the centaur. Muriel puffed out her cheeks and blew through her lips as she knelt down onto the ground pillow, then rubbed at the flush on her neck. Emily picked up the paper menu in front of her and chucked her tongue.
Let me tell you, Muriel, you sure do reel 'em in.
Oh, shut up, Emily, Muriel said with another angry blush, setting down her snub-nosed M2 on the ground beside her. Food was of course not on Emily's mind, despite the fact that Yapuya was already picking out a feast for herself, and she leaned back in her chair, angling herself towards the men and their game. She was closer to a large horned man who wore a light rain jacket and blue jeans, his antlers reminding her of a young moose. She peeked around his shoulder, seeing that they were playing a holographic war game.
Rome versus the Gauls, I assume?
Emily asked, and the horned man leaned back towards her in a half-turn, smiling as multiple cohorts were trudging up the holographic field.
Roma Invicta,
he replied, and the light, honey-sweet tones of his voice caught her off guard. On the other side of the table, a dwarf sat, his arms half-crossed as he tapped out orders on his digital keyboard. A small contingent of naked men bearing nothing but shields, swords, and smiles charged out of a nearby woodline, and the dwarf reached over with his free hand to grab a mug of beer as he spoke.
You rely on your praetorian cohorts to carry you, and we all know it.
Emily thought his rougher, gravelly voice fit him just fine, and she looked around with raised brows as the other men jeered and nudged at the horned man's shoulders. The horned man quickly sent forward a small line of skirmishers to try and stem the tide of naked men running at his main line's flank, and Emily decided to try her hand.
So,
she began as the gloomwalker from before set down 2 pots of tea and cups for everyone at her table. She also noticed he had gotten Muriel a larger mug with flowers on it, as well as a small sweetbread.
I'm trying to find a building that has a swept roof and has a red lantern hanging out front. Would any of you know where that is by chance?
She punctuated this by holding out a small pinky nail-sized sapphire, and the dwarf tilted his head at it, appraising it on the spot. He seemed to find it worthy of words and held out a large hand. Emily tossed it over to the dwarf, and he pulled out a pouch out from under his neck, tossing the little gem inside it. He cleared his throat, and another unit of naked men flooded out from their hidden spot in the forests to crush against the skirmishers sent forward by his horned opponent.
You're wanting the parlors of Madame Errata, and you can't find the building right now because she's not open.
Emily blinked, and the dwarf tapped a few more commands on the keyboard before looking back up.
Parlors are hidden until she opens, and she should start business in about an hour.
What is her business? Emily asked, and Yapuya let out a victory screech as multiple loaves of dark bread, borscht, varenki, pancakes, and piroshki were set down on the table. This time the horned man turned to Emily as his cavalry began to countercharge on the opposite flank.
She deals in drugs, mostly. They call her the Dream Eater because she consumes dreams and packs them away for others to enjoy. She'll then take these dreams and lace them with narcotics for interesting effects. She also deals in flesh, as do most down here, but caters to an extremely niche clientele. You'll find her parlor half a mile down this street, then half a mile west.
Right, well, thank you, Emily said with a smile, then turned back to her table just in time to snatch the last pancake away from Yapuya. When the time came, the bill was paid. The Gauls found victory over Rome, and Emily stepped back out onto the large sidewalks with her crew in tow. As they walked, the tone of the surrounding areas changed as everyone got off their shift and left in a prowl for food, comfort, home, and vices. The enlarged sidewalks and the alleyways of the terraces now swarmed with those who lived and worked down in the twists of Vegas. But still everyone gave both her and the other groups of divers a wide berth, as if getting too close would have rubbed something off on them. Emily followed the direction she was given and hummed in her throat when she came before a large, Oriental-style building. Its 3 levels of sweeping roofs reminding her of some kind of temple or pagoda. As said, a plain red lantern bearing a black moth and centipede hung out front, and the front gardens of the building were tidy but desolate of people. "Are you sure this is the place?" Morrill asked, and even Tarj seemed to have reservations in his eyes. Emily turned, looking over her shoulder at everyone who had gathered behind her, and shrugged. "We passed by this bowling ball shop twice our last pass through here, and this building was never here. If I had to wager a guess, this has to be the place." Morrill shared a look of unease with Tarj, while Davin trailed after Yapuya, the harpy having sprinted ahead to happily jump into a shallow pond that gathered below a small burbling fountain. Emily held out both her hands and gave both Morrill and Tarj a pat on the shoulder, then stepped down the stone-lined pathway to the front door, Davin managing to wrangle Yapuya out of the water. Both their giggling halted the same time Emily slammed to a halt, as the door before them slid to the side on its own. The thick smells of incense, herbs, and old wine furled out of the door as if it were a spirit, and the only light from within was the dull crimson glow of other lanterns. Emily felt more uneasy now than she had only a second before, and a slow curl of anxiety coiled in her stomach.
What? Big scary door going to stop you in your boots now?
The torque said into her head, and she mentally scoffed at it before resetting her shoulders and strutting towards the open door with false bravado. Everyone ambled their way in, Morrill having to duck her head past the frame, and as soon as Davin passed through the door to watch their 6, the sliding door moved on its own again, gently closing behind them. Emily screwed up her nose at how thick the smell was now, and she could barely make out the twang of sweat and passion that swam below the undertones. The room around them on the first floor of the pagoda was almost suffocating despite the size of it, as lanterns, incense burners, and long billowing hangs of red silk surrounded them at every angle. Yapuya let out a yelping sneeze, and down near the center of the room, the soft voice of a woman spoke up.
"Bless you."
Emily squinted, and within the haze of incense smoke and red silk hangings, she could make out a person standing behind a low desk. She walked towards the desk, rolling her boot steps to keep them quiet. Morrill and Tarj kept tight behind Emily, and Yapuya and Davin watching around behind them. As soon as they broke past a large drifting thread of incense smoke, the figure loomed into view, and Emily's breath stopped still in her lungs. The woman was an insectoid humanoid, her large, almond-shaped black eyes fixed onto Emily. A single ring of yellow ran around the center of her eyes, but they held no malice. Her face was human, bearing soft features and lips as black as her eyes, despite her flesh being so pink that it was almost white. Her long, flowing hair was also black, as was a ring of fluffy hair that ran around her neck. The hair was so thick that for a moment Emily thought she was wearing some kind of rough or animal skin, but saw that the hair continued about the collarbone where it terminated. The most insectoid parts of her were large, gossamer wings that lay low behind her, and any time they twitched, a soft glittering powder wafted through the air. mingling with the incense smoke. Following the wings were the two large fanned antennas on her head, the large plush spokes giving a soft twitch here and there as they picked up vibrations. Her clothing was very odd as well, and Emily couldn't decide if it was a sarafan or a kimono.
How can we, of the Soft Sting Temple, help you today?
She asked Emily, and her voice was so gentle it could have been carried away by a glance. Emily began, rolling her fingertips along the grip of her mare's leg. A friend of mine said that someone here could help me find something I was looking for.
Oh, very good. Not going to summon any suspicion with that kind of answer,
the Torque said with a raspy laugh into her head, and Emily squinted an eye, a smidge in annoyance. The moth-woman smiled politely and bowed her head a few inches.
Ah, you must be the one the mistress spoke of. I'll take you to her now.
Uh-oh.
The Torque said mutedly, and Emily felt the words escape out of her own lips as well in a hushed hiss. The moth-woman gestured politely and took the group back through another sliding door to a winding wooden spiral staircase. More of the crimson silken sheets and streamers hung there, as well as incense burners that jutted out from the wall. Emily noted with confusion that the moth-woman was wearing jungle combat boots, as the heel and toe poked out just enough from the hem of her lower skirt to catch Emily's eye as she walked. As they passed by the other levels of the pagoda, Emily began to understand that each level seemed to be tied to a service they offered. The second floor was lined with couches, ground beds, and animal-furred futons, on which lay people that exhaled soft steam of smoke when they breathed. Around them sat attendants who dripped droplets of liquid into their mouths, and Emily almost startled off the edge of the staircase, only just saved my morale. These attendants were more insectoid women, and while some were more human-like, like the moth, others were far more insect, such as a praying mantis woman who gently cradled a man's head in her glistening talons, only to use her more human hands to place a droplet of liquid onto his tongue, steam pillowing out of his mouth as soon as it hit his flesh.
Come along,
the moth-woman said, and Emily hurried after her, no one else in the party particularly eager to stick around either. As if sensing their question, she turned her head slightly as she continued her steps.
There are those who want their worst dreams, nightmares, or memories pulled away from their mind. We do this for a small charge, but at the same time, there are some who wish to relive those memories. Some people wish to know the horror of war, the aching pain of loss, or even feel the horrid dread of drowning. We do pay top dollar for good memories, naturally, as there are some customers who just wish to know the love of family or the soft kiss of a wife they never had the ability to have.
What about big bug ladies?
Yopuya cried out, having also spied the praying mantis woman cradling the dreaming man. The moth woman giggled to herself, then cleared her throat, her black eyes glittering.
Well, most customers come for the dreams or memories, while others come for both that and the company of women who are far beyond the normal lines of accepted attractions. Every woman and man who works here share the same properties of physical attributes.
Old people here bug?
Yopuya cried out again, and her eyes widened in curiosity. The moth woman giggled again and nodded.
Yes, all people here are bug, little harpy.
The second floor was a brothel, and Emily could tell just by the thick smell of sex and the gentle moans or groans that filtered out past the large double sliding doors. Lamps within this level cast deep, dark shadows of figures intertwined, some more than others, and Emily hurried past without delay. Yopuya, however, hooked a hard turn to go past these doors, and only Tarja's quick hands were able to grab her by the shoulder strap of her M79, dragging her back towards them. At the third level, the doors were closed and ornate in their carvings and designs. The wall panels, hangings, and streamers were woven with the scenes of jungles and deep forests, while the doors were carved to look like snow-capped mountains and the barren wastes of a tundra.
That's quite the breadth of terrain,
Davin said with a smile, and the moth-woman turned to match that smile with her own.
Mistress Errata is of two lands, and finds love in both of them. Please, take off your shoes and place them there.
She pointed towards a small shelf near the doors.
Then we can proceed inside.
Everyone who wore shoes or boots took them off, and even Marill had to shake off her hoof boots, as the moth-woman shook her head gently when Marill tried to say they weren't actually boots at all. With Marill grumbling, the moth-woman opened the first sliding door and stepped inside, then stepped to the left to let them pass through. Inside this third level, multiple moth-women sat on couches, their colors as inky black as the night, or as vibrant as a scoop of rainbow sherbet ice cream. Unlike their escort, all of these women wore armor of leather and chain, and held great glaives or halberds across their laps. Emily saw that one of the larger moth women had not 2 but 4 arms, one of which held a long, elegant pipe that trailed smoke the color of mugwort. At the end of the room was a large daybed that must have been over 10 feet long, adorned with pillows made from the soft white furs of cold-weather animals, blankets of silk and cotton, and a large quilt that looked to have been handmade by a child, its many colors clashing and weaving consistent. Sitting upon this large daybed was a massive woman that sent a chill of fear down Emily's spine, and she heard Tarj gulp audibly behind her. Just as her guards, the woman wore leather armor, but also wore a loose crimson gown with ruffled white fur along the edges and sleeves. Her large flat hat was half ringed with soft black lace, and by the shimmer of light around the rim of it, Emily assumed that it was ringed with sharp steel. She was a wide-hipped and endowed woman, and must have given many an excited man a fright when they found out what else was waiting for them below her enticing hip bones. It was here that Emily found her own eyes lingering, but it was not out of lust, as her eyes were widening with fear. A few inches below her hip bones, her body transitioned into the chitarous lower plates of a centipede, and her armored legs flexed idly. Her lower body coiled around itself, and at the very end of her body were two larger gripping appendages that were clasped in silvered steel, the metal of which was carved with lotus flowers and large pointed mountains.
Ah, the fair Emily Bronze finally graces me with her presence.
Mistress Errata purred, and her body began to uncoil, her many legs finding purchase along the couch and ground with a chorus of hisses and clicks.
We were starting to take bets on whether or not you would pass by for a third time looking for us.
Emily was surprised by her accent, as Russian had not even crossed her mind. Emily swallowed as Tarj whispered something under his breath, and then inclined her head towards Mistress Errata. "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was expected."
I've known of you for a few days now. Mika has been watching your streams since we learned of you.
Mistress Errata gestured toward the rainbow sherbet-colored moth woman who held a halberd, and she twiddled her fingers at Emily. "Thank you for your patronage," Emily said in a confused tone, and Mistress Errata chuckled, her body slithering off her couch and clicking its way towards Emily. As she got closer, Emily now understood fully just how large Mistress Errata was, and she could feel Marill's panic radiating off her skin.
You are in the dreams of many who are tied with the mysterious of magic. There are those who have seen your coming, as well as the whims of your mistress, though who she is blocked, even to me.
Mistress Errata began, and came to a stop before Emily, bending forward and down so she was only 2 heads taller. Emily could see that every one of her teeth were pointed, and her canines were massive.
The girl chosen to save this plane that is shared by many, a girl marked by death himself.
"Yeah, I've heard that a time or two again," Emily said flatly despite her nerves, remembering her lunch date with Mela. "Then, if you know why I'm here and who sent me, are you going to tell me what I need to know, or are we going to be annoyingly cryptic to each other and vague?" Mistress Errata laughed deeply and reached forward with one of her hands, rustling Emily's hair until the point it stuck out at odd ends, then ran her hand down Emily's braid as a sad look came over her face.
Naturally, I want to help you. There has been a lot of good business down here in these dark depths, and I would rather not see it all go away. I don't think there will ever be a place like this again, a plane where others meet and collide. I know what you need, even though its real form is clouded to me, and I know who keeps it.
Mistress Errata clicked her teeth and smiled, then wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders as she began to lead Emily towards one of the couches. Emily wanted to shrug away the arm and get away from those clicking legs as fast as possible, but was worried what would happen if she did. She looked up at Mistress Errata. "So, it is actually down here, not at the lake?" Mistress Errata nodded with closed eyes.
I would imagine that was a ruse to draw you out, but there are more than just 2 players in this game.
Emily breathed in through her nose and found that Mistress Errata didn't smell of anything off-puttin', but instead smelled of fire-smoke, tea, and some kind of floral perfume that she couldn't place. "I don't get that. I don't. How can so many people know about me?"
Magic.
Mistress Errata sighed softly, then tilted her head.
You also play computer games on the internet machine.
Emily screwed up a corner of her mouth in an annoyed gesture, and she was placed down onto a couch. Morel walked up beside her and stood beside the arm of the couch, watching both of them warily while Tarj, Davin, and Yopuya were standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, not sure what to do. Emily sat there quietly, chewing over the thoughts in her head, and was even more annoyed that the Torque was silent, offering nothing in help. Mistress Errata gave her space, waiting in front of her with her body coiled around itself. Tarj, Davin, and Yopuya found somewhere to sit, which ended up being the lap of one of the moth women in Yopuya's case. Emily continued to mull over things in her head, frustrated that it seemed more now than ever that she was a single pawn moving in between multiple kings and queens, all vying to either help her forward or snuff her out like an errant candle. Emily looked up at Mistress Errata and breathed in a wheezing breath through her nose before blowing it out through her lips. Okay, well, where is the thing I need to grab and who has it? Mistress Errata frowned in the way someone does before giving the worst of news. Then she rested a hand on Emily's knee.
Let us have some tea, and then we can discuss the creature that grows down below us in the depths.
Creature? Emily asked, as Mistress Errata snapped her fingers together at a hidden servant in the corner, a smaller woman who looked like a scorpion. Mistress Errata looked down at Emily without moving her head, and she pursed her lips together before she spoke. Obviously not a fan of whatever this thing was.
The weaver of the flesh rafts. The one who bored a tunnel straight to here in order to have more things to play with and create, and is flooding the lower levels with salt water.
Mistress Errata turned her head now as the scorpion girl scuttled off to fetch kettles of tea, and she leaned down closer to Emily, who drew back an inch at the sight of her dagger-like teeth.
We do not know his true name, but we know what he likes to be called. I speak of the Flesh Tailor.
And that is the end of the first book of Emily Bronze. I hope you all enjoyed the ride, and of course I do plan to write another one of these. Now the thing is, instead of trying to do like the split 2 and 2, 2 and 2, I'm just going to power through the book entirely. So right now I'm writing section 222 for the Veil Rider series. It's going to be a more platoon or squad based book than company brigade sized. And then once I finish section 222, then I'll start on Emily Bronze 2, and then the next Veil Rider book, and the next Emily Bronze. I'm going to go with that way. That way it's I kept losing my path in each book, because I would go 2 chapters there, 2 there, 2 there, 2 there, and I kept getting like my tone of voice mixed up, which is kind of bad. But anywho, if you haven't joined the Discord server, be sure to do it now so you get, word faster of how the book's progressing, how the cover art looks, all that fun stuff. There'll be a link down below in the comments for a Discord link. Additionally, like I said before, stop by all of our affiliates. And thanks for being here. I mean, more or less, you guys keep this ball rolling. And right now, I'm more or less using my YouTube money to literally pay the voice actors, because I think they deserve the money. And unfortunately, AdSense has been a bit turdish, where they're like, if I don't make $100 on AdSense, they hold the funds till next cycle, which is a bit fucky, but whatever. I guess I'm too peasant enough to understand it, but more or less, YouTube pays for the voice actors, and any kind of book sales and donations pay me to keep everything running. It's a pretty whack system, but I want the voice actors to get the money they deserve, you know what I mean? If you want to donate to the page, because you're running ad blockers or what have you, I get it, we all do it. There's a Ko-fi link down below where you can donate $1 or $2 to help keep the channel running, help get the voice actors paid, all kinds of fun stuff. All that jargon and such. Anyway. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for keeping us running, and thanks for listening. Truly, we all appreciate the fact that you guys are still here, listening to us even in 2021, now coming towards 2022. And more or less, I've given up trying to be publish. We're just going to do it ourselves. Fuck it. We're going to put on our Thanos gauntlet, do it live, and do it ourselves if need be. You know what I mean? But until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Garbro, that was Eliza, that was Dusty, our sweet Beldam, that was Aristic, that was Icicle, That was Vin, that was Fire, and this is Garbeardia.